You are listening and watching Sweats, Heels, and Mental Health Podcast,
where we have girl talk with a mental health twist.
Please click subscribe and listen and watch for our next episode.
Hello. Welcome back to another episode of Sweats, Heels, and Mental Health Podcast. We're coming back with season 3. I'm one of your co-hosts, Marshawn Drawn.
And I'm your other co-host, Maria Drawn Bush.
And of course, as you know, we're twinning with winning women. Today, we're actually embracing, as we should every day, who we are, our Black History Month. We really just wanted to kind of come in and discuss the importance of us knowing our history and teaching our youth our history. I know in school, a lot of times when we think about African-American Blacks, it's slavery. That's it. Or Dr. Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, maybe throw a little Frederick Douglass in there, Harriet Tubman. But that's it. You know what I'm saying? There's so much more broader scope of our history and who we are. I know that as a young kid, I thought that, Africa was poor. That's what I saw on TV. I didn't have my own personal experience or knowledge about it. Didn't go any further than what I saw or was taught. And then putting that with slavery just kind of made sense. Like, oh, we didn't know nothing. But going to school in college, HBCU, Fisk University, I really did learn a lot more about my African-American history beyond just Alvin Alien roots. Kind of felt like I upgraded then, but even beyond that, other inventors, doctors, lawyers, and just who we are on the other side of the world and where we come from, our ancestry. So just how important that is to me and teaching my son and even anybody around me. Maria, I know you had a similar experience too, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Going to attending high school, learning about the greats, Dr. Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, but it stopped there. We didn't learn about Marcus Garvey and all these other great men and women who made a great impact on civilization, a great impact on just the earth that we live on. And so it wasn't until I attended Fisk, being on the yard and being in a community where professors wanted you to learn more about yourself and where you come from, and cared a lot deeply about the students, where they taught us different things, and it just opened up my perspective. And now, just like you, Marshawn, I have 2 kids, and they're both curious, now looking at different things that are going on in social media and media in regards to our community. I want them to be informed. And I know that there are other children and other parents that want to do the same. And so we have a special guest today, which I'm excited about, Mr. Albert Lowe, who we call AJ, Professor AJ. He is an amazing individual, very well-versed in our history, just history period, very intelligent young man. And I'm just grateful that he joined us today on the podcast. Mr. Professor AJ, do you mind giving us an introduction and tell us a little bit about your background?
Not a problem. I am a Kansas City native. First off, my name is Albert AJ Lowe. I'm a Kansas City native. Went to Central High School and ended up going to the Florida A&M University. I graduated with a bachelor's in African American Studies and a master's in history. I've been teaching collegiate history, Black studies, and U.S. history 1 and 2 for about roughly 12 years now. I'm also a co-host on a podcast / radio show called Ebony's Bones, and I also am a commissioner on a live debate podcast called The Great Debate League. So yeah, that's pretty much me in a nutshell. I'm passionate about African American studies. I specialize in 20th century racial violence and lynch culture. So yeah, that's me.
Wealth of knowledge.
Yes. Welcome it all. Yes. Absolutely. Just with your expertise and your knowledge and even your experience, I see so many of our African American, children who don't know their history. And I really believe if we know who we are, where we come from, it connects us to each other more, it connects us to our community more, and it helps us have a sense of self. Can you tell me what your thoughts are on why do you feel it's important for our youth to know their history?
I think it's important not just for the youth, but also for the parents, for everybody to understand Black history. Primarily because the reason why we have Black History Month is because, or even Black History period, is because a lot of African American history was omitted, primarily because of a white supremacy or Eurocentric standpoint. So a lot of our achievements and our major contributions to civilization, world civilization as a whole, have been omitted, skillfully and consciously omitted. And that dilutes how we view ourselves, our self-worth, our self-value, and it also empowers others. And it allows for us to empower others in our minds. So therefore, we look at white places and white spaces as being superior, primarily because the knowledge of ourselves has been suppressed. So I think that Black history is extremely important, and it should not be relegated or delegated to just 1 month out of 12. Yeah. When you start looking at how many major contributions African Americans have done for not just American civilization and society, but world civilization and other societies, it's quite clear that we are rich in our history, but it's quite sad that, in certain areas, people go out of their way to make sure that we don't know some of those contributions. And again, a lot of that has to do with trying to maintain this idea of white supremacy.
Mm-hmm.
So we keep going. I keep going.
Yeah, I was about to say, can you speak on what white supremacy is? Because I think some people have different definitions of that. So
okay, well, the ideas of what white supremacy are ideas that whites are superior or better than everyone else. And you see this idea really start to emerge right around the 16th century, about the 15th and 15th century. The 16th and 17th century rather, which would be your 1700s, 1800s, primarily because of the transatlantic slave trade that was going on. A lot of the racism, modern day racism, starts right around the transatlantic slave trade, primarily as a justification for treating these Africans like they did on the Middle Passage, like the justification for packing these people in like sardines, shifting the shark migration patterns primarily because they were throwing dead bodies or live bodies off of slave ships when the provisions were running low. And then the overall treatment for African American people or Africans in the diaspora, the horrible treatment that they experienced, and not just the United States, but also in places like the Caribbean and South and Central America. And this idea still is quite prevalent because it explains certain things like social Darwinism, like why Black people are at the bottom of the social totem pole, as opposed to white Americans or white people, period. And white supremacy itself is not just something that is just marginalized to the United States. That is a world concept, which it goes to explain what happens after the transatlantic slave trade ends, going into the 20th century. And then you start to see colonialism happening in places like not just Africa, but also India and Asia, where Europeans went there, took over the area, took all the resources, and then subdued the people and subjected them to other forms of white supremacy, saying, well, not just if you're white, but also if you are a light-skinned person or closer to white, you have more privileges in these societies. So that's where you start to see things like colorism coming out of it, which is something that the Black community still deals with today. So that's primarily what white supremacy is, like this idea that white people are better, are superior, and pretty much rejecting anything that African Americans or people of color have done or contributed to society.
Yeah. Absolutely. And, you know, as a therapist, I see how much that impacts us as the people of color. I think colored people, because I feel like, you know, I see a lot of women, for instance, who come in, and a lot of men as well, with low self-esteem, with low regard of themselves. And if they understood how much power and treasure in where they come from, you know, how much that would empower them and able to not have to seek out external things to increase their self-esteem or self-worth, that it doesn't have
Actually, I'm sorry.
No.
I didn't want to cut you off. You got me pumped up because there's this, I don't know if you can see this book. It's called The ISIS Papers by Dr. Frances Cress Wells. And
Love
this
that
is
book.
the one, and she speaks to the African American psyche. On like how Black people view themselves and how white people view ourselves in on a psychological basis in the United States and in the world. You know, she has been a lot of white scholars view her literature and her scholarship as, like, you know, out there, but it really makes sense when you start dissecting some of these ideas in white supremacist culture and in a white supremacist country, especially in regards to, like you said, the treatment and how Black people view themselves in a country or a world that tells you that you are superior if you are a lighter skin or white. Which again, and a lot of the things, some of the things that aren't really discussed when we start talking about Black people in the early 20th century is one of the major advertisements in Black newspapers were for skin bleaching and hair straightening products.
Yes,
so even though you have, you know, Madam C.J. Walker and her products, there are also products that were primarily made to bleach Black people's skin, which Black people still do today, and then to straighten their hair, which is a multi-million-dollar business that is sought. I think it's on the downside now.
Yeah.
But when I was a kid in the 90s, which I don't mean to tell how old I am, but when I was a kid in the 90s, you know, perms were something that were definitely in high demand.
Oh, listen, I was Sean perming each other's hair. Come on.
Yeah. Soon as it felt.
We gotta straighten it.
Put that burn on your hair, man. But I think we've definitely come a long way. Yeah.
Women aren't the only ones. Men aren't exempt to this ideology too. In fact, when Black men think about, a lot of Black men, I'm not going to say all, but a lot of African American men think about beauty, they usually think about light skin, which is also a byproduct of continuous white supremacy and on the psyche.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
In the mind,
right.
And that's that they can attack us here. Yeah.
And then what it does to like, for example, a lot of dark-skinned women who are beautiful, they end up having self-esteem issues as well, primarily because they view themselves as not being pretty.
Yeah. And
they're beautiful.
Our youth go through that. I think, like you said, the adults go through it, and that is, you know, put into our children's mind, where, you know, they're going to school and, you know, young ladies who are biracial, you know, they have this very curly, loose pattern of hair, and they're made to feel like they have this good hair. Or other young girls are jealous of them because society, this propaganda of, you see in commercials of what the ideal woman is, has this loose, curly hair or straight hair and very fair skin. And so all these different types of things and belief systems are being placed upon our children, and adults need to be aware of this so we can combat that.
Yeah. Psychology is deep, and when a child is immersed in a predominantly white area, so like for example, a child that grows up in a predominantly white neighborhood, that goes to predominantly white schools, they're going to start to that's going to start to affect their psyche. And you know, they start seeing, and I've seen that myself. You know, thinking that, you know, white is better.
Yeah.
You know, but then, like I said, colorism is something that Black people just have to deal with. And I think that if we took the time to really understand what colorism is, and like how instead of and this is my personal belief, I think that if African Americans worked on and focused on our own communities, we would be able to better combat that, as opposed to going to predominantly white areas and talking about the racism. For example, going to an HBCU, one of the things that I had to learn is that even though we didn't have to deal with racism, we had to deal with colorism and classism. For example, there was me and the young lady were discussing, we liked each other, and she was suggesting that the reason why we couldn't like date seriously is because my skin was too dark.
Wow.
Which I couldn't understand at the time, but what was the book called? How the Other Side Lives. I think that was the title of the book.
That sounds familiar.
It was another book primarily based off of the classes or the colorism that happens in the Black community with middle-class African Americans, especially going into the 20th century, that started to associate themselves with lighter is better, like doing things like taking a paper bag test.
Yeah.
And if you're darker than this paper bag, then you're not going to be accepted into these affluent Black areas. Yeah. So the ISIS papers speak to that. And then there's another book called by E. Franklin Frazier called The Black Bourgeoisie, which is a really good book. You start talking about the Black middle class. And in fact, that book is still very much valid and pertinent right now in 2022, as it was when it was published in the 1950s.
My gosh.
That's excellent. Yeah, I like that. Drop them
go on and on that topic.
Yeah, we're definitely going to be having another podcast about colorism.
I will be tuning
it's such
in.
A big thing. Yes.
Oh yeah, it's major, and a lot of the things that African Americans, we are unique in our experience, but the fact that and I think this might just be America, period, is that we fall in love with nostalgia. This idea of remembering what happened back then in the past and all of that. And you can see that represented in a lot of the television and entertainment right now in 2022. But a lot of those ideas are still very much with us, that survived when our grandparents were alive. They're still very much with us. And we hold on to those, even though we might not know what we're doing in a lot of the cases.
Right. Absolutely.
So yeah, and I'm sorry to keep talking. There's another example that popped in my head when the other day I was discussing slavery in my class. And I was explaining that African Americans, we want to get away from slavery. We think we know about slavery, but when I showed a film, just a little clip of a film from Amistad, from The Middle Passage, that Steven Spielberg actually made.
Yeah.
And it showed them whipping this gentleman into submission. A lot of my students couldn't even look at it. Yeah. And I'm like, well, how could you deal with or say that you know about slavery and you can't even deal with just watching this, because this is really what happened. And a lot of the things that we still do now, which I talked about, Black people jumping brooms. You see that in the lower middle class or lower class weddings, all the way up to the most affluent African American weddings, where you see Black people pulling out this broom and then jumping over it.
Yeah.
And I know that is, again, we always try to get away from slavery, but we're still continuing these same practices, like eating chitlins.
Yeah.
That is something that I think that is not just, and what I found out is, because in my class, a lot of Mexican kids, my Mexican students were asking, well, isn't that in Mexican culture? And I was like, I guess so. I don't know. Is it? And then I asked them, well, were you guys forced to do that? Because we were forced to do it. Like, we had to make do with these discarded pig parts, like the snout, like the pig's feet, which is completely disgusting.
Yeah.
The intestines, the stomach, the hog maws. I said we had to do that primarily because of all of those good parts going to the house. But now you have Black people associating that with soul food. Yeah. Right. And so I think that for as much as African Americans try to get away from slavery, what I find fascinating is that we know very little bit about slavery, and we still practice a lot of the slave like ideas that that were just passed down as like, oh well, this is just being Black.
Right.
Well, what hoping we can get to that place where we can change that narrative and change that traditions where we're connected to before slavery. We're creating traditions in our family and our generations that are connected to our ancestors past before slavery. But right now, that's all, folks know.
I like to see that.
Yeah.
Yes.
I like to see that. Yes. I'm not as optimistic though.
Yeah. It's sad, unfortunately. Yeah.
I'm not as optimistic primarily because, when it comes to African Americans, like I think that from what I've seen is that African Americans right now, and living in where I'm at right now, Kansas City, African Americans would choose to complain about racism and then in white areas, then do something about the Black areas. Mm-hmm. When it looks like the Black areas, it's like, oh man, well, we can't do anything about that. So we're going to try to build a Black community in a predominantly white area, which, going to a HBCU, I've found out that it's very difficult to try to create a Black community that you do not live in. Right. Especially when things like tax dollars go towards your school district, which ends up improving the neighborhood. So, so if your tax dollars are going to another place, how can you start to build on a Black community that, that you don't live in? So, we can talk about this all day.
Yeah, it's deep. And it goes so beyond just what we see. It's so bigger. It's so much bigger. It's bigger.
It's much bigger. Much, much bigger.
And,
one thing, go ahead, Ree.
No, go ahead.
One thing I was going to say that kind of fascinates me, and I know we were talking about this too, well, me and we were kind of going back and forth on this, is how if we sit in America and we look at the different cultures and traditions of other nationalities or even of the minorities that are considered minority, they all kind of have something that brings them together. They keep their tradition, their culture, their foods. And it's just amazing because it seems like Black people are lost and always trying to find it when we have it. And like you said, it's building that sense of community, but also that's why I think it's just so important about knowing who we are before slavery, how great we are, and just knowing about where we come from, because that tradition, that culture, that knowledge can help cultivate, us to have our sense of our own so we can continue to build and put into our communities for these kids. And I just be telling Maria, man, if we teach this knowledge for ourselves and we teach our kids who we are, what we were, and how great we are in 50 years, what does that look like? You know what I'm saying?
It could be major. And so when you start looking at African Americans, especially like I said, how we live right now has a lot to do with a institution that we are constantly trying to forget. Yeah. For example, I was talking to a couple of my friends who are Jamaican in descent. Their parents were from Jamaica, so I think a couple of them were actually born in Jamaica and then moved here. And they were talking about how they retain their culture. And a lot of I got frustrated, not because of how they were talking about their cultural retention, but how we have lost ours. We had to lose ours in order to make sure that we were able to survive in a predominantly white country. Yes. There's a book by this gentleman by the name of Winthrop Jordan, and it's called The White Man's Burden. Mm. And in The White Man's Burden, he discusses like how slavery was able to survive in the United States, but he poses a question. He says, in other places that had African slaves, they were able to fight. They fought all the way up, they rebelled all the way up until the end of slavery. But African Americans stopped rebelling after Nat Turner, which is like 1831. So you don't see any more rebellions, like from 1831 until slavery ends in 1865. So he said for over a 30-year span, that Black people just stopped rebelling. And he just poses that as a question because he doesn't know the answer. I don't know the answer. And, with that speaks volumes to how we survived and a lot of the things that we had to give up. For example, what happened to the Native Americans is quite similar.
Right.
Like the Native Americans were forced under pacification and being Christianized, they were forced to give up their culture. And in a lot of spaces and areas, they had to in order to survive. So that's similar to what we went through, except they were still able to retain a lot of our things. So reaching back for Black people is a really tedious job because a lot of us don't even know where we came from. Unfortunately, people like Alex Haley were able to trace it back. And in some areas you have like 21andMe or Ancestry.com or even BlackAncestry.com, which is able to trace you back to Africa. But, a lot of Black people, especially in the United States, we're starting to just getting into traveling and, going back and tracing those African roots is not something that the populace of African Americans are even, I don't know if we're ready to do it, but we're surely not doing it as a whole. I would love to see it. Don't get me wrong, I would love to see it, but it's just something that we haven't seen yet.
Yeah.
I think for both of you both said, I think, when a person feels lost and disconnected, their behaviors, their thought patterns, what they even hope for is impacted. I think about even kids that are in the foster system or been adopted. They don't know their history. And so somewhat they feel disconnected, trying to grab onto something that makes them feel like they belong.
Yeah,
and I think that within mental health, even with our youth, they're grabbing onto things that is creates
reaching.
Oppression, and trying to, fill this void, with cars, materialistic things, women, all these different things. And like you said, these different hairstyles and all that, but know the core of who you are. And so tell me, when it comes to adults and us parents who want to teach our children, inform ourselves more, what are some credible websites, or I know you mentioned some books, but what's the best place for a parent or youth to start looking and researching? Because it's so much out there in the world of internet and misinformation as well too.
Good websites. That's gonna be difficult for me, and I'm gonna have to. I don't know if I can actually answer the website question, only because I don't really go and look for a whole lot of websites discussing Black history, because I'm bombarded with it every day, especially in my literature, in my teachings, in my classes, but there, let's see. Can I come back to the website? Let me think about that for a second.
And you can post it to us, and we can post it with the video as well too.
Yeah, because I feel like I don't want to give you guys a source that I haven't checked out yet first and made sure it's not, because in this era of where we have where we're supposed to be living in the information age, it's only created disinformation, because anybody can post or create a website and they can easily steer people in the wrong direction based off of faulty research, lack of research. YouTube is one of those. YouTube and Wikipedia and Google are one of the main culprits in disinformation, especially when it comes to Black history, because in this era we're living in, where we don't have a whole lot of information, that makes sense, therefore it has to be true, is the main culprit for a lot of our disinformation. So let me think about the websites. As far as the books, I can give you a lot. Now that's something I could definitely help you with. When you start talking about ancient Africa, especially in regards to a lot of the contributions, there's a gentleman by the name of Sheikh Anta Diop. He wrote 2 major books. One of the good books that I used to have in my class was African contributions to civil. No. Yeah, I think it was African contributions to civilization, myth or reality. That's at Cheikh Anta Diop, and his second book was Civilization or Barbarism. That was his masterpiece. You also have Dr. John Henry Clark. Any book from those two are really good. All their writing is really good. Now, Cheikh Anta Diop is from Senegal, so he speaks French. So some of his original writings have to be translated into English, unless you speak French. Let's see. Dr. John Henry Clark is good. I think I had another one. Walter Rodney, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. That was a really good one. Let's see, African Glory. And I might forget some of these, the authors' names, but African Glory is another one.
You told me about one called They Came Before Columbus.
Oh yeah, actually I got that one sitting right here. Yeah. And that's by a gentleman by the name of Ivan Van Sertima. Can you see it?
Yes.
Awesome.
That's Ivan Van Sertima. And this book primarily talks about how Africans were visiting the United States, or the Americas rather, prior to Columbus. Actually, one of the things that I explain in my class and I go into detail with is that if you look at Columbus's 4 trips, he made 4 trips to the Americas, and well, he made 4 trips to the Caribbean. He never touched the mainland, but he made 4 trips to the Caribbean and 3 trips back. His third one, he was arrested and taken back to Spain. But on the first one was the one that is most interesting, because you can tell he didn't know where he was going. He was just sailing straight. He was going through the currents, which currents are very rough, and they'll carry you. So he's fighting the currents at least twice in order to get over to the Caribbean. And then once he gets there, he starts navigating very differently. He'll start moving in a circle with the currents, but he doesn't do that until he gets to the Americas. Now the question is, how did he get that information over there and not over in Europe, right? So that's primarily what Ivan Van Sertima focuses on, and he talks a lot about the Olmecs in the Yucatan. If you've ever been to this place called Cancun, which is a popular destination site, I would encourage everybody to go and visit this Mayan ruin called Chichen Itza. And a couple of 100 kilometers southwest of Chichen Itza, there were 17 Olmec heads. And they call them the Colossals. So, and if you get a chance to check them, they're in Veracruz. There's one in Mexico City, but there's like, the rest of them are in like Veracruz and La Venta.
Visit back in October for my birthday. It was to Chichen Itza, and man, it was awesome.
Yeah. So I'm sorry. My apologies. I get excited. I'm sorry.
I know.
When I was on my last, it wasn't not the last time I went to Cancun, but the second time I went, I had just read his book over again. I read it for the second time, and what he was talking about was how these Olmec heads have a date on them, but the date is in dots and lines. And what he explains is there was a numeral system that can go to infinity that was created right around the time where the Mayans and the Olmecs were there. And it consisted of only 3 numbers or 3 symbols: a 0, a dot which signified a 1, and a line which signified 5. So he explains that they were able to make a calendar out of that. And I have the calendar actually, it's a circular calendar. I have the calendar actually somewhere in this house. But if you go and check those out, they actually have dots and lines on the back of those Olmec heads. And they actually signify a date on when they were created.
The Mayan people were just a very highly intelligent.
Yeah. So were the Olmecs were too. And what Ivan Van Sertima is saying in his books are your original step pyramids are coming from Egypt, right around the Nile Valley area. He said, but when you see these Olmecs pop up, now you start seeing these step pyramids pop up. And these Olmecs look like black faces. And I mean, Mexican people will fight you over So a lot of Mexican people will fight you over that
Yes,
because they feel like there's a theft on their culture as well.
right.
But what Ivan Van Sertima is saying is that it wasn't so much of like a dominant thing, but more of a blending and like helping. Because if you go to Chichen Itza, it's not just this step pyramid; it's an entire complex. And one of the things they have is an observatory.
It's beautiful.
Right, and your observatory is also known in ancient Kemet or ancient Egypt because they had created a calendar by 2300 BCE. So 2,300 years before zero, and we haven't even got 2,300 years after zero, they had already created a calendar that included 365 days plus 7 hours. So they were able to come up with an entire, like, that also compensated for a leap year. So that extra day, they came up with an entire calendar that included a leap year every 4 years.
Yeah.
So he says, well, you see that here in Egypt, and then you see that over here in the Yucatan.
Yeah.
And then they start building step pyramids. And so he's making a link. And he also talks about these African coins that are found in Mexico. He's like, well, how did they get there?
Right.
You know, tobacco, smoking devices and all of that. He's like, well, how do these devices and these coins end up being sometimes replicas and in some cases like authentic to Africa? How do they get to Mexico? So that's a really good one. I know you guys don't want me to talk about slave books. There's a lot of those. But and again, one of the things that I think that Black people don't recognize about this institution of slavery is that it was absolutely horrible, but the resilience of Black people can be highlighted primarily out of this institution that was made to break us.
Yeah.
Like that just shows that we can bounce back. If we can bounce back from that, then that and segregation.
Yeah.
Lynch culture. Lynch culture happens immediately after the value of Black people's lives are reduced to nothing. The monetary value of Black people's lives are reduced to nothing. That's when Black people start lynching Black people, killing us indiscriminately, usually with vigilante justice.
Yeah.
Right? We were able to survive that.
Yeah.
Like we're still here and we're thriving at this point.
Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of books, and those are just a couple, especially when we start talking about the African glory. People like Mansa Musa, who was he was the Bill Gates, Warren Buffett person of the 14th century, of the 1300s. He passed out so much gold that he devalued the metal in Cairo, Mecca, and Baghdad. In 3 places, he devalued the metal. And he was so popular that he's represented on European medieval maps. They got this Black dude holding a nugget of gold.
Represented.
I think all this information, I just would love for my children, generations after me to be exposed to this. But I was talking to Marshawn about this thing with the critical race theory, and wanted to hear what your thoughts are, because to me that just snatches the opportunity for children have to come to school, and I think that's the perfect place for us to continue these conversations. They start at home, but for us to continue these conversations. But tell me what critical race theory is and what your thoughts on.
So in a nutshell, this idea of like critical race theory it's number one, it's a theory. It's, people treat it as gospel. But this really came out after the 1619 Project produced a host of documents in their New York Times. It was a New York Times series called the 1619 Project. And in these series, they talked about how race has been instrumental in just about every part of the creation of what we know as the United States. So you start talking, and this was published literally, 400 years after African Americans arrived on the shores of Virginia, which you see African Americans or Africans showing up They are in Virginia, the Virginia colony, 1619. They show up at this place called Fort Comfort, and they're sold to the English by the Dutch, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what happens after that is you see ideas and events that are created in the not just the Americas, like not just the United States, but also in the colonies that end up creating and dictating and codifying what race is in the United States. Now, the idea of critical race theory is that those events and those racist events end up crafting itself into something else, snowballing into something else that is absolutely essential in the United States, known as race, right? Race and racism, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the reason why it's such an issue in schools is primarily because white Americans are not ready or willing to address the wretchedness that comes from their history.
And
so what it does is it dismantles this idea of these white quote unquote forefathers that African Americans are expected to adopt as forefathers as well, even though those same people were creating institutions that African Americans were banned from participating in, right? So one of the things we do in my classroom, and even in my class, there's no way that, and I explain that to my students, especially on the first day, I let them know that if this is a romanticized version of American history that you're looking for, that you should withdraw from this course, because that's not what you're gonna get here. We're gonna discuss it, in all reality. And one of the things we discuss and talk about and read word for word is the Constitution and the 10 amendments known as the Bill of Rights. And in that, you can see how racism affects all of that. Yeah. You can see protection for a transatlantic slave trade. You can see a fugitive slave act, right? You also see how the enumeration of people who were regarded as citizens and the slaves are counted. You also see how people are using skillful use of wording in order to make sure that they don't even use the term slave or slavery in that document. Those are two words you will not see in the document, but if you dissect it, you are able to see that somebody was being crafty when they were putting these words together in order to make sure that they didn't say slave or slavery, but they meant slave and slavery, right? So you see all those things represented in the Constitution of the United States, which is supposed to be learned by all students in classrooms. Now, if white students were to learn this, they would also have questions about not just their forefathers, but also people who are related to them, as far as like grandpa, great-grandpa, right? And things that, we can easily dissect and see that are connected to racism, right? So this idea of the critical race theory shouldn't be touched in classes is preposterous and still continues a white supremacist ideology agenda in the classroom, and to make sure that white people feel comfortable in these areas when they're discussing their own history, which again, it is impossible. It is impossible to discuss American history with any type of authenticity and not discuss race. It's impossible. Unless you are intentionally getting around certain issues in order to make certain people feel comfortable.
Right.
So that's pretty much, and I'm still paraphrasing on the correct terms or the correct definition of critical race theory, but that's pretty much it in a nutshell.
Yeah. And this is adopted across the United States, or are there specific states, just to be clear, and our audience have some clarification on that?
Oh, you're talking about as far as like which, like the ignoring critical race theory?
Ignoring it and adopting it.
Okay, so a lot of schools haven't adopted it. That's not something that you've seen. What they are trying to do is primarily prohibit the ability to discuss it. saying that, well, we don't even want to discuss this or bring this up. Primarily, and you'll hear the justification is, well, we don't want people to feel bad about being white, right? Which is not actually addressing the issues, and we're still romanticizing about American history. And what I find fascinating is they're not taking into account anybody else feeling bad either. Right? So, I've talked to a lot of people who send their kids to predominantly white schools, and what I find is very interesting is that, there's special attention given to those students, those white students, in order to make sure that they feel safe in those classrooms and not feel attacked, and that they feel comfortable. But that same attention is not given to those Black students or students of color in regards to certain topics like this. So it's not being adopted, but what you see is a conscious effort to make sure that people don't discuss it. And you see certain areas like Texas and Florida going through extreme lengths. One of the things I noticed about Texas is they had created, this was like towards the latter half of the year of last year, 2021, they had created documentation that had went through their state legislature that pretty much said that critical race theory can't be discussed. But in that critical race theory not being discussed, they said that certain things had to be discussed, like the Constitution had to be discussed and taught. They said that the 13th Amendment had to be taught and discussed. The 14th Amendment had to be taught and discussed, and the 19th Amendment. So if you don't know the Constitution, what they're talking about in the amendments is that the 13th Amendment ends slavery in the United States, except for punishment of a crime. So that means that our legal system, our penal system is still very much American slavery. And it says that in the Constitution. The 14th Amendment pretty much says two things. The first one is that anybody born in the United States is an American citizen. The second part of the 14th Amendment, which I notice is always glossed over, talks about how if you prevent anybody from voting, then you lose representation in Congress, right? Nobody talks about that part because, then we would have to revisit that whole segregation thing where Black people couldn't vote, yet nobody lost representation in Congress. So that's a whole different conversation. And then the 19th Amendment, right, which guarantees rights or the right to vote regardless of your gender. So there's one missing because the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment all came around during Reconstruction, right? But the 15th Amendment is neglected in their legislation. They're saying that we can talk about the 13th Amendment, we can talk about the 14th Amendment, and we can talk about the 19th Amendment, but we can't talk about the 15th. And the 15th Amendment pretty much says that you cannot stop, that race shall not be able to prevent you from voting, which I find fascinating, is that we can discuss slavery, the end of slavery, we can discuss citizenship, we can discuss the right to vote based off of gender, but we can't discuss the right to vote based off of race. And then you start going and looking at what they're doing as far as the disenfranchisement of Black and people of color when it comes to the voting, and then you see an agenda there.
An agenda, absolutely. And I think if, this generation that's coming behind us, they are very, they're sharpshooters. I think they're very direct. They're not for the okie doke. And I love it. And I think the more information we get into their hands, the more they can rebel and stand up and advocate in ways that our generation did not and has not yet. And so, and I agree with you. There are some states that are going to lengths. I see some, the lengths to not talk about race or this critical race theory. Some schools are even removing, or libraries or institutions are removing certain books and textbooks for students to have access to obtain this information. And so it's mind-boggling.
They're trying to make sure that white privilege still survives. And the way that white privilege and white supremacy and racism work is when they are operating in the ambiguous, when they are operating in this area where people don't know,
right?
Or where it's not really seen. Therefore, people can say, well, I'm not being racist, or so-and-so's not being racist. They're just a bad person, right? I'm not being racist because, that person just doesn't qualify, right? But that's how racism has been able to operate in this level of ambiguity where people can't tell that it's there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So they're ambiguous to, well, is this racism or not? Because, and that's how racism survives. So I don't see it as something that is ever going to go away. In fact, I see racism as an essential part of American culture, just like poverty is an essential part to capitalism. You can't have capitalism if you don't have poverty.
Poverty, yep.
Right? So yeah, I see that as essential, and I don't see it going anywhere.
So tell me, I think about children that are privy to that information about their history, and they go into these classrooms that are conducive to white supremacy and keeping them not in the know. How would they carry themselves? How do we encourage these parents who send their kids into these institutions? What is the right way or the best way to challenge when they hear Miss Tanner say the XYZ and it's clearly incorrect?
Yeah, and they correct them. They ain't got no problem letting them know. No, that's not it.
Yeah, and I mean, giving them, even though you were quite specific on the name of the teacher.
I made it.
You're kind of specific on that name of the teacher. Which, all right. But for me, and a lot of that, I would suggest it has to come from the parents. Yeah. But it has to be the fortitude that security will create the fortitude to be able to push back against someone who is in a position of power. Right. Because even that is difficult to do as a child. Yeah. And you're talking about us, like, I knew children, and when I was a kid, I knew students that would challenge the teacher. I wasn't one of those students until I got to college. Right. I would, challenge them in certain, areas other than, like, I wouldn't speak up, but I might not put Columbus Day on a paper. That would be my way of resistance. But I think that that type of fortitude has to come from what's taught in the home. Yeah. And it has to be past just television. Yeah. Like, that's where we get into the real reading. And that's where I think that the real meat comes from. The due diligence has to be from the literature, and not all of that can, like, this literature has to be set down and people got to read it. Now, I would highly suggest the thing that has been quite instrumental in these last couple of years, which is the audio books. If you can't read it, then get it on audio, right? But I think being exposed to it in a level outside of the classroom, especially in a predominantly white school, is what gives people not just the information, but also the fortitude to actually say something, to push back. Yeah. It gives them the self-confidence to push back. Because I can guarantee if nothing is said, then the teacher's going to keep going. Correct. And nothing's going to change, And I also think that Black people in the 21st century need to start really valuing our own Black spaces. Yeah. We went to HBCUs. I can't speak for you guys, but a lot of my self-confidence and the ability to speak up for myself. Yes. Right? My self-confidence, a lot of the fortitude that I have right now when it comes to speaking out against white supremacy, I acquired in college. Yep. Right? Seeing other African Americans in powerful positions, right? That are uncompromising in faces of white supremacy, right? I had an instructor one time, we had a white instructor who said something that was rather racist. And when we went and complained to his supervisor was Black. And we told him what he said, and then he made him apologize to us. Wow. Which was something that I had to step back from, like, oh, this is different. It's good. I've never seen nothing like this before. Like, you know, and then listen to like, go ahead, apologize.
Yeah.
You know, that was something that was very empowering for me, to the point to where instead of creating these utopias that only exist on college campuses, we can make these utopias a reality if we want to.
Yeah, if
we want to. But it's not going to be easy, and it's definitely going to take some work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I definitely say these dropping, it's just starting the conversation. You know what I'm saying? A lot of people, I feel, think the woke people, you know, and, you know, we have our says about that, but there's a lot of knowledge out there, and it's just so much information about our history that we need to know. And I just think taking the first step as individuals, period, wanting to know about your own ancestry, your own history, and then teaching it to your kids, because we know they're not going to get it at school. And reality is, stuff is passed down from, look at other cultures. It's not something they learn in school. They learn it from the generations, the grandmas, the mamas, the uncles, the great aunts, books, any kind of artifacts we have passed down in our generations and families. That's what we learn. So it's our responsibility and due diligence to teach our kids.
Right.
So they can carry it on. And like I said, how great would it be if we did that? And in 50 years, I'm hoping I'm still living, and I'm hoping, you know, that I can see that. And I hope that's my hope, you know what I'm saying? But just to know their history, you know what I'm saying? And to apply that.
And like Malcolm X said, it's not just the conversation, but eventually we're going to have to start getting into some action.
Action. Yeah.
You know, and what a lot of that comes from our indoctrination from the television.
Yeah.
Like, we watch a lot of shows, even though a lot of those black shows that we had in the 90s, those positive black shows don't really exist. A lot of those white shows are still very much about indoctrination.
Yeah.
You know, we can't trust Mickey Mouse to completely teach our kids properly.
Right.
Mickey Mouse has no skin in the game.
No.
They have skin in the game in regards to white supremacy, but they don't have any skin in the game in regards to black empowerment.
Right. Absolutely. And, you know, and now this is another podcast, but, you know, TV shows like Bill Cosby and Different World that me and Marshawn grew up in watching. I mean, that Different World was one of the reasons why I wanted to go to a HBCU.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so that, seeing that, feeling like I was a part of that campus, drove me and to want to get my education on a historical Black college university campus.
Yes.
And how much more we need those types of representation. As they say, representation matters, but we need those things.
I don't watch Bill Cosby anymore, but I definitely watch A Different World. I have my own issues with Bill Cosby right now, but I still watch it. I'm boycotting Cosby right now, but I still very much watch A Different World, even though it was a Cosby production.
Yeah.
Like, I don't have to see him all the time. And like, again, what you said was absolutely like correct. I wanted to go to a HBCU because I was watching that, and I had cousins. I had a cousin that went to Fisk. I had a cousin that went to Southern. I had a cousin that went to Clark Atlanta. We used to have swim meets at Howard. So like, going to Black schools was something that, you know, that really wasn't on my mind for real. But when I got the opportunity to go, it was like, oh yeah. Once it got presented as an idea, it was like, yeah, this is where I'm going. Yeah. So, and a lot of that came from watching students go to this fictional HBCU that I thought actually existed. I was looking for Hillman.
I'm trying to go to Hillman.
Where's Hillman at? They look like they are kicking it.
Loved it. Yeah. Loved it.
No. So I agree. And I wish that, like, for example, what's the show, Blackish? You know, those shows are brought out now that have Black characters with generic storyline. And the people who play on that show will tell you, you know, this is a show that can be for anybody, and it's casted for Black people. Yeah. But at the same time, like, when we start really dealing with Black issues, which I really do, and I haven't seen the new Fresh Prince, but the Fresh Prince, I want to see it. I want to be able to binge it. I don't like waiting. I want to binge it.
First 4 episodes are at.
Yeah, the episode aired tonight. Yep, the fourth one.
See, I want to wait. I gotta wait.
I know you want to watch it.
I want to wait until it's all over, and then I can go ahead and watch it on a weekend, on a nice weekend, and just stay in the house and watch it. But what I appreciate, and the reason, because the first Fresh Prince was okay, and I kind of used to watch it, but it wasn't something I was like into. Not like I'm about to be into this one, because I feel like it's going to be dealing with a lot of the real issues that the Black community has, like what we discussed in the beginning. Colorism, right? Classism, right? I think that all of those major two issues is something that African Americans need to deal with if we are really trying to create a Black community.
Yeah.
And I'm grateful that they're discussing them, and I wish we had more Black, not everything we have to laugh about everything. Some of the things we have to deal with are dramatic and traumatizing.
And we need it.
Oh yeah.
We need it.
100%. 100%.
And we do need it. And on that tip of mental health, I think we do need those shows. But for your own mental health, if you can't, like for me, I still have not seen a few movies that people have recommended, because it is heavy and it is traumatic. And so you do have to kind of pace yourself in some of the things that you read, some of the things that you watch, because it is overwhelming at times. And so you do have to take care of yourself in that while you're educating yourself and your family. Yeah,
because it's overwhelming. It is.
Oh yeah. I show a film called 12 Years a Slave.
Yeah.
And one of the things I explained to my students is that, it took a Black dude from England to make this movie. And at the same, we like to watch Django, and because Django's a fiction movie,
right?
It makes us laugh a little. We watch that one,
right?
But we don't really watch the reality of what slavery was.
Yeah.
When it comes to like 12 Years a Slave, because what he had to go through was traumatic.
Yeah.
Anybody that has kids, I don't have children, but anybody that has kids, I can only imagine listening to my nephew cry about losing his mother and never being able to see his mother.
Yeah.
Right? And you have to deal with that on 12 Years a Slave. And a lot of the issues that the Black community has, it derives from slavery and our inability to actually deal with it. A lot of my history that I got drawn to, especially like lynch culture, was because my parents and grandparents never discussed this. And when I got older and I started studying this, I came back with a little attitude. I had a chip on my shoulder, and I asked my mom, my grandma, why didn't you tell me? If you knew these white people had this ability, you knew this, right? And they were like, yeah, we did. So why would you not tell me? And then again, why would you consciously put me in a predominantly white area where that was like the worst educational experience I ever had in my life, where I was fighting every single day. I was fighting every single day, having white kids call me the N-word. And this was in 6th grade. And I'm like, well, if you knew that, why would you send me to this school? And they were trying to give me my mother, God bless her, I love that woman. But what she was trying to do is do what all Black parents want to do, which is give their kids a great opportunity to get an education. Right. What they didn't understand is that, some of the things that they had to deal with never left.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. One of the things I show in my lynching lectures, and all of the lynching photographs that I show, there are children present. Why are the children there? Because the children are going to keep this thing going.
Absolutely.
So we got to, we can't be so sensitive when we got to discuss our history. Not everything is going to be milk and honey. Right. Sometimes you got to dig in the mud and the poop.
Meat and potatoes. Yeah.
Potatoes. I think Michael B. Jordan, I got excited about this. Speaking of Mansa Musa, he was supposed to do a film.
Some type of movie about Mansa Musa?
Yeah.
That would be awesome to watch. That would be actually very empowering.
Absolutely.
Right? To see him, Mansa Musa, his brother, Abu Bakr II, right? to see Nanny of the Maroon, she's a Jamaican that happens in, like, she's leading a Jamaican rebellion during slavery. But even Toussaint Louverture in Haiti, who actually brings it, those are the Black people that bring about their own freedom. Mm-hmm. We need to have a movie about that.
Yeah.
It'd be amazing.
Amazing and empowering.
And empowering.
And it's real. It's based on true stories. I love Black Panther. However, we need more movies that, like you said, empower us, that provide us with that history.
Yeah.
And we're starving for it. Yeah. Look at the response to Black Panther. You had Black people showing up like they were king and queen in Zamunda. They acted like they were showing up at a wedding in Zamunda.
Yeah.
They showing up in like suit and ties with like dashiki and like dashikis on and all these kente cloth and, you know, like if you remember what happened in Zamunda in the first Coming to America, people were showing up at the wedding in suits and kente cloth and, you know, and that's how Black people showed up for that. Because we're starving for that. We want that, right? But what's stopping us from creating that?
That's a question, and I think it's more deeper than what we think it is. I think, you know, we are making strides in the film and theater, but no telling what kind of slack and what kind of fights and battles they're having to face on that side of it when they're trying to produce movies like this for us. So absolutely. Well, Professor, I don't we could be on here all night, but listen,
I'm telling you, this is look,
I listen. I don't give me opportunity because I run my mouth. This is what I do for a living.
We appreciate it. And so insightful. I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation with you. Do you have any last words or encouragement for our audience that are listening?
All I'd like to say is that African Americans, we know better and we can do better, but we have to be inclined to do it. Like, we have to have an inclination in order to change our things. Instead of complaining about racism in predominantly white places and white spaces, we have an opportunity now. We have the capital to change where we at and what we doing. We just have to have the inclination to do it.
Yes, action.
It's some action.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, let's start and act. I'm with it. I'm with it. Well, as you always know with our podcast, we always honor a woman, or even, you know, for our History Month, male or some type of history. But one thing I definitely want to give a shout out to is the Olympic gold speed skater, first African American, Miss Erin Jackson. Wow, thank you. That's just an inspiration, and, you know, for young girls, for young athletes. Just to know they can take the world by storm. Thank you for representing women. We want to give you flowers today. And I just think that's an awesome stamp in our history. Just showing that Black excellence and positivity in Black culture. So, yeah.
Absolutely.
Do your thing, girl. We want to honor her today.
Congratulations. We're super proud of you. Keep winning, ma'am.
Yes.
Snaps for her. Snaps for her.
Snap. Yes. Well, Professor AJ, thank you so much for sharing, you know, your expertise, your knowledge, and even your experience. I'm so excited about your future. You're a powerful man, sir, and you're doing a powerful thing with your students and with the people around you. So I appreciate you gracing us with your presence.
Yes.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been wonderful, and I'm honored for the opportunity.
Sir, awesome. So thank you for your time.
Love y'all. Well, love you, girl. Thank you, AJ. Until next time, good people.